heavy is the head that wears the crown for this prime minister. He campaigned on this. He has been largely leading the conversation on his own, and now he'll be the one to have the consequences of the outcome.
Ladies and gentlemen, today is deal day, and Mark Carney is running out of road. This is the day he has to deliver a trade deal, even an interim one, with the United States. But the details now linking into the mainstream media put him in an almost no-win position. Either walk away and risk another round of punishing tariffs, or accept a deal that reportedly demands major Canadian concessions in exchange for scraps. Even mainstream media outlets are now openly questioning whether Mark Carney could sell that kind of agreement to Canadians. Let's take a look. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is an excerpt from the Globe and Mail. In dozens of conversations with sources on both sides of the border in recent weeks, who were not being identified because they were not authorized to publicly disclose details of the closed-door negotiations, the Globe and Mail has learned what a prospective deal would look like, what the holdups are, and what Canadian officials have said will happen if Mr. Trump fires another tariff broadside at Canada on Wednesday. So, ladies and gentlemen, we've gone through this so you can see what is actually going on. And this is what the U.S. would be giving Canada, as reported from the Globe and Mail. So, you'll notice it's not very much. First one is cut auto tariffs from 25% to 15%, keep an exemption for US-made content in Canadian-built autos, cut steel tariffs to roughly 10 to 15% within a quota, and higher rates are above that quota, cut aluminum tariffs to a single-digit rate within a quota, so they're still paying tariffs on it, but there's a quota, and if you go above that quota, you're paying more, and then back off on the threatened August 19th tariffs, where there's $20 to $30 billion of Canadian goods that are actually going to be facing additional tariffs. So this is what they get. We get lower tariffs. We don't get elimination of tariffs. We get lower tariffs. Objectively, it's better than we have now, but this is not what Mark Carney promised during the election. He was promising a deal that was better than the current USMCA. This is not better than the USMCA. It's not better than the USMCA, especially when you see what Trump is demanding of Canada and what the Canadians are discussing giving them. This is what the US is demanding from the Canadians and Mark Carney's government, and this is what they're considering. Number one, drop all retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods. Number two, end the provincial bans on U.S. alcohol sales, meaning all the U.S. alcohol goes back on the shelves. Scrap or scale back Buy Canadian procurement policies from the federal government. Accept the U.S. interpretation of the dairy license allocation. We've been talking about this for weeks. The U.S. is not happy with our interpretation of the dairy clauses in the USMCA. Give the U.S. a right of first refusal on Canadian critical minerals. Basically, when critical minerals are available and they are on the market, the U.S. gets first dibs. Move ahead with the $88 billion F-35 purchase by U.S. defense systems, including the Golden Dome, and provide some assurance of increased oil and gas exports. So we get a little bit of a drop in tariffs, and they get the house. Right of first refusal on critical minerals. More oil and gas. We drop all our tariffs. We buy the F-35s. We scrap Buy Canadian, despite the fact that the Americans have Buy American, by the way. And there's all of these things together. This is a fleece. An utter fleece. And Mark Carney and his government is considering this. Okay. This would be an absolute disaster. But he's put himself in this position. This is what happens when you don't negotiate, when you shoot your mouth off and all of this stuff. Now, by no means is Trump offering anything fair. Just saying. You want us to take off retaliatory tariffs, but you want to keep your tariffs on us? How does that make sense? You want to keep your Buy American policies, but we can't have Buy Canadian policies? How does that make sense? This is in no way any sort of fair offer. But this is where we are. And this is what Mark Carney said that he was prepared for. This is what Mark Carney said he was going to handle. But the relationship with the United States has gotten far worse under Mark Carney. Who would have thought? Who would have thought that the relationship with the United States would be worse under Mark Carney than it was under Justin Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland? I don't think anybody thought that that was possible. But this is where we are. This is where we are, and the mainstream media is weighing in on what may happen today.
What is the best case scenario out of all of this? What does it look like for the Canadians and even for the Americans?
Well, the best case scenario would be a deal that eliminates all tariffs and keeps CUSMA in its place. You're going to hear something from me, Karina, as a former colleague you probably never heard. I don't know what's going to happen.
What?
I think there are some things we do know and we can discern. I think we can discern without a doubt that Canada wants a deal. I think for some time that was in doubt. A lot of people were telling the Prime Minister that it might be better off just to walk away without a deal, because politically he may pay a price. He may pay a price because he said that he was going to deliver a deal that would be even better than CUSMA. Mm-hmm. But we now know that Canada wants a deal. If he does get a deal, it will be measured against the PM's promises. So that's something else we know. There are three possibilities. One is, and I think the most likely scenario, given the intensity of the discussions, is that there is an extension of the Section 338 tariffs before they're applied, and they keep talking. I cannot understand how a president, including a Twitch president like President Trump, would say, let's blow it up by applying the tariffs midnight Wednesday at 12:01, because the talks seem to be inching towards progress. They're very quiet. The second possibility is we have no deal. And Minister LeBlanc and Janice Charette get on a plane, come back to Ottawa and consult with the Prime Minister about what we do next. Mm-hmm. And the third possibility is a deal. I think it's a more remote possibility, but it seems to be there.
Kate, what are the worst case scenarios?
Well, I think the worst case scenario is we are without a deal, no path to getting a deal, and we have the application of the tariffs as they are. Workers have been in a lot of pain for a number of months, well over a year, in the case of steel and auto and aluminum and lumber and others. So certainly the worst case scenario is that the Trump administration makes good on their threat. I do think it is a bit concerning when the question was put to the Prime Minister today, what does a good deal look like? He was not really able to articulate clearly what that was. And I think when you compare that to some of the previous commitments he's made around securing a better deal, and then moving that to, well, we already have a great deal, the fact that he's not articulating specifics around even sectoral tariff impacts, to me, says that maybe things might not be as close as they ought to be at this particular juncture. And he may be keeping his powder dry, frankly, to be able to say when we do hit a deal, oh, well, this is the best case scenario. But he doesn't want to articulate that now because he wants to be able to sell whatever we do end up with as being the right deal for Canadians. Or if we end up without a deal and we have to retaliate, then maybe that was the best deal for Canadians. But he's not being particularly forthcoming about what it is that looks to be in Canada's best interest.
Although, to be fair, we are really down to the wire right now, and his defense of not being specific today was not negotiating in public.
And I take that point when we're less than 48 hours away from the deadline, but he hasn't felt particularly obligated to keep Canadians in the light on these negotiations really for the better part of over a year now. And again, we've been talking about a lot of these issues, Karina, around sectoral tariffs and supply management and all these other things for 10 months. And it's really whenever the Prime Minister deems it to be in his interest to share information with Canadians that he decides to do so. It's hard to campaign on this as kind of your core issue and not be more transparent. It's not term sheets, but we are getting very little information. And the Prime Minister, I think, because he ran on this, owes Canadians a little bit more than what he's sharing.
I'm just aghast at the pickle that Carney put himself in. And I think this is a result of arrogance. I think this is a result of him thinking that he's more capable than he is. And I think he thought that everything was going to be great once he went over to Europe and started hobnobbing with his buddies. And that's not what's happening. People in Europe and businesses in Europe are rubbing their hands together, waiting for Canada to further exit the market with the United States so they can actually swoop in and get it. Just like GFANZ, when Mark Carney, tried to set up this whole, green initiative with all the banks and these investors, it was all sold on a lie. And that's why GFANZ collapsed. And all of these major businesses pulled out, like BlackRock. BlackRock's pulling out. you know that it's not working. And when you have Mark Carney essentially now boxed into a corner today, and this is what's on the table, you get some tariff relief, but you have to give away all this stuff, and you have to bend the knee to Donald Trump in the United States again. That's not going to go over well. The alternative is that there's no deal, and then the tariffs get applied. Well, now you're going to have businesses across the country crushed. And this is all over the front page of CBC of what would happen if these tariffs actually come to pass. So he's screwed if he does, and he's screwed if he doesn't. And Kate talked about transparency. We've talked about this. We've talked about the vast difference between the Canadian government and the Mexican government in terms of their transparency when it comes to negotiating with the United States to try and get this new deal with the USMCA done. And just listen to the first part of when they go to the Liberal. Check this out.
How does the Canadian government effectively calibrate its message behind closed doors when Washington keeps shifting the goalposts?
I think they just have to be transparent about that, I think, and they have been.
Oh, so the government has been transparent, has it? Yeah. I would call malarkey on that. Let's go back to Rob, because he actually brings something up about the premiers, and this is important. And we've called this out as well.
Do you think Washington insiders, or even inside the negotiating team, how seriously do they take this unified message that Canada is trying to push in terms of the no appetite for concessions, we're Team Canada, we're unified? How seriously do you think they take that?
Are we unified? I see a lot of provincial premiers essentially saying that they're going to have a veto over how this turns out. I see some provinces with American booze on their shelves and others without it, and some provinces saying they won't put it back unless they get what they want out of the deal. Look, we do have a prime minister who has empowered the premiers in a way that other prime ministers haven't in the past. Perhaps the notion is that if Washington understands that they are not the only unpredictable actor in all of this, it may work to our advantage. I see Washington actually taking advantage of the division to apply tariffs where they think that it might hurt us most.
Remember, we were told that Mark Carney was going to unite Canada and eliminate division, and it's the Conservatives that were responsible for all of the division in the country. I think we know that that's not true. Because now you have the individual premiers looking out for their provinces, as they 100% should, by the way. But you have them all disagreeing with each other because of this. So if you're trying to present a united Canada front against the United States, that is not what's happening. And as he says, Trump's taken advantage. And you've let him take advantage.
Kate, in terms of the Team Canada approach, do you think that's still a strategy worth pursuing, or has it reached an expiry date?
I think it fell apart a few months ago. And, you know, to Rob's point, the application of the tariffs has certainly been punitive on the provinces, or the prospective tariffs, excuse me, have been punitive to the provinces that have the alcohol bans. There's a direct map. That Venn diagram is a circle. So clearly it is a pain point. I do think that the premiers have been, like many Canadians, shut out from status updates on the conversations. You saw a lot of that frustration at the Council of the Federation, premiers kind of speaking out and saying openly that they didn't really have information from our government about the status of conversation. So if you're going to approach this as Team Canada, you kind of have to bring the team along with you. So I do think that they have been largely left out of the conversation, as has a lot of the opposition. And in the previous round of negotiations, there was more of an effort from the Trudeau government to include members of Conservative caucus in border ridings and involve them in the outreach, and that has been absent as well. So heavy is the head that wears the crown for this Prime Minister. He campaigned on this. He has been largely leading the conversation on his own, and now he'll be the one to have the consequences of the outcome.
This is what he said he would do, and this is the day where he's supposed to prove himself. Now, I'm not sitting here cheering for Mark Carney's failure, because Mark Carney's failure is failure for Canadians. That's not good. What would be great is if some miraculous deal happened where all of the tariffs go away and we get a deal that's in Canada's best interest. And I would cheer for that. That's not what's going to happen, though, unfortunately. And this is CTV's Vashi Capello's commenting on what may or may not happen today as well, and she's not confident. And this is the trouble that Mark Carney is navigating himself into. He has spent all of this time riling up Canadians, riling up anti-American sentiment, but, you know, it's the Conservatives that are supposedly dividing. And people aren't traveling. People aren't spending money. People are openly, criticizing Americans, despite the fact that the average American has nothing to do with what's actually going on in the trade sphere. But now that same base that he has riled up, they are so anti-American, they're saying, do not concede and do not give an inch. Well, here's the problem. When you're in negotiations, you have to give up something. And Mark Carney has repeatedly given things up. Now, before this week, remember, this is the poll that people are talking about. This is the Angus Reid poll. 62% wants Canada to respond with counter tariffs of its own. And only 43% are confident Mark Carney can deliver a good deal, down from 51% in April. This is what he's dealing with right now. So unless it's a good deal, counter tariffs. What happens if he delivers both a bad deal and he concedes? And he takes off all the tariffs? Ladies and gentlemen, this is what Mark Carney's political situation is dealing with. And there's one more thing that Mark Carney and Donald Trump are talking about. And this should illustrate that there is some strange discussions going on between these two governments behind the scenes. Also from that Globe and Mail article, some commitment on critical minerals may be written into a quote-unquote phase 1 deal this week, the sources said, even if it's just a broad agreement by Canada to work with the U.S. toward a more detailed pact. Check this out. Two of the sources said progress on defense and Canada's representatives on U.S. demands are expected to weigh on what Washington will agree to in the current deal, even if it isn't put into the text. One of these sources said, for instance, that Canada could privately agree to the F-35 purchase with the understanding that it only becomes public when a future phase agreement is signed. This would allow Mark Carney to take one of these concessions off of the public table as it relates to this interim deal and announce it later and position it as if it were part of a separate deal. Meanwhile, he committed to that concession right up front. This is the type of non-transparency that is going on behind the scenes, and this is the type of shenanigans that Mark Carney and his Liberal government are actively engaging in. So they understand that Canadians are ticked off about the concessions. This demonstrates that he's not acting as though he has complete immunity from what is going on in Canada. And what happens if Mark Carney's personal opinion polls begin to drop as a result of this. That's going to have an effect on the Liberal polls at large. You already have a bunch of people in caucus that are ticked off at the way Mark Carney's been talking to his MPs. What happens when these MPs start now openly challenging what he's done on this deal? And then Mark Carney gets even more irate and he gets even more impatient with these MPs. What ends up happening, folks? Maybe you end up with more resignations. Maybe you end up with more, I can't travel to Ottawa anymore. And then you end up with a situation where we're back to even more by-elections, but perhaps lower Liberal polls. And then we end up in a minority government. And when we're in a minority government again, all bets are off when it comes to an election. So I cannot overstate the stakes of the next 24 hours for Mark Carney. And it doesn't look good.